I've actually known Liz virtually for many years. Today is the first time I met her, and it's the first time I've had a conversation. Because indeed, Liz made a contribution, again based on Kenya, but that time on refugees, to this book that was edited by myself and Fiona Leach about education, conflict and reconciliation. I mean, and Liz is the pinnacle because it's the last contribution to that on refugee life in Kenya. Today it's a slightly different affair, so I'm just going to step back, let Liz go ahead, and just say welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm actually really delighted. That's a really warm welcome. But I am going to start with an apology about the abstract for this talk, in case it struck you at all as sort of self-promotional, because I was kind of on the run when I was handing in that abstract, although I very much wanted to come here and do this. And so I just ripped the blurb off the back of the book. And of course, that's a bit of a marketing blurb. It's an endorsement of the book. It wasn't an analytically descriptive abstract. And so I apologize. And so I want to start at zero now without that self-congratulatory tone of the abstract. So yeah, with that first apology. I am so pleased to be here because I get to talk about this new book that I've just published. It's just quite fresh out, Burning Ambition, Education, Arson, and Learning Justice in Kenya, from the University of Wisconsin Press. And I'm going to try and tell you quite a bit about the book. I'm going to try and pack in quite a lot to give you sort of a sense of the book and its main themes. So I'll start with my growing interest in this topic. So as I said, I started going to Kenya in 2003 as a master's student. I was doing that publication is from my master's thesis, going out of that. And so I was spending time in the Dadaab refugee camps in northeastern Kenya, thinking about young people that had been very encouraged to go to school and had been convinced, and their families had been convinced to send them to these schools in the camps, and then very few of them could go on to secondary school because there just wasn't that capacity in the programming at the time. And so I was tasked by Care Kenya to do some research with young people about what was happening in these post-primary years and their experiences. And so one of the methods I used when I was there is I volunteered at a secondary school in one of the camps in the composition classes as students were preparing to write their composition essays for their exams. And one afternoon I showed up to do my volunteer teaching session with them, and they weren't there, the students weren't there. And I heard from other teachers, oh, well, they've marched, they're on strike. They have walked away from the camp approximately 10 kilometers down this dusty, hot road they're not actually supposed to be allowed out of the camps to do, to a government police post in the city of Dadaab, in the town of Dadaab, where all the NGOs were clustered. And they were doing this because they were on strike. So I followed them there. I went up to the police post and sort of was trying to figure out what was going on. And they were upset about all kinds of things about the quality of their education. The teachers weren't showing up. The teachers weren't very good. They weren't going to be able to compete against Kenyan students that were going to be receiving the same exams because they didn't have the right, good enough quality of resources. And I was kind of astounded, and I reflect on this a little bit in the book, of the sort of gall of these students to actually go on strike and to call it a strike. And so I was really puzzled about what was going on there. And of course, I had to reflect on where my puzzlement was coming from and why I thought that was odd. And so I do some of that description in the book. And then just from that, I became kind of curious as I was doing other research in Kenya on other topics related to children and young people, but not about education. And I started just collecting news clippings, paying attention to them first, and then collecting them about student strikes. And paying attention to these strikes. Sometimes they were marches, sometimes they were sit-ins in secondary schools. I was paying attention to specifically. And then arson, then student strikes, this word strikes being used, as well as the word unrest, and then students setting fire to parts of their school. And so I just kept collecting these stories for years, and then finally, after doing a postdoc research on some other things in Western Kenya, I was there and I was curious, and I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna spend a bit of time on this. And so I was curious. I was talking to people that I knew and about it, and everyone had a story. Oh, my nephew was at a school and they did that. Oh, I remember when in these years we did this, and all these stories were around me. And then I had friends saying, calling up or texting saying, I was in Kisumu at the time in Western Kenya. Did you hear there was a fire at this school yesterday? No, I didn't. It was on the radio, they said. And I was like, okay, I have a friend, a Kenyan friend there. I hired him to drive his car, and we showed up. I showed up at the school the next day. So this was in June 2013. So I'm going to read a little bit about that scene, just so you also get a taste of how this book is written. It moves between sort of genres, and this is definitely ethnography. So this is the start of chapter 2. In the middle of the night on Sunday, June 23rd, 2013, a group of boys at Kengeso Secondary School in Western Kenya rose from their bunk beds and began to stir the others. The message spread quickly through the dormitory buildings that strike was on. Several boys were shouting directions at others, and small groups rushed to different targets. One set of boys attacked the TV in the recreation hall, kicking and hitting it with other objects until it was in pieces. Another group broke into the administration office and smashed the photocopier. Other boys broke into the kitchen storeroom, tore open sacks of sugar and rice, and scattered their contents across the floor. Several boys commanded and pushed others to gather on the field between the school's classrooms and the principal's house. For some, it felt rebellious, exciting and dangerous to be outside under the night starry sky, running around with the other boys. Many of the younger boys, the Form 1s, crowded together, scared of the unpredictability of what was unfolding. A few older boys ordered them to join hands to make a human chain, effectively preventing any students from running away from the havoc being wreaked on the school's properties. At the bottom of the sloping field, approximately 100 meters away, a small group of boys crouched around the principal's car, with one boy using his mouth on a bit of hose to siphon the petrol out of the car's tank and spitting it through the car's broken windows onto the car's seats. Another then lit and threw a match onto the petrol-soaked back seat. A cheer went up as the car's seats burst into flame. Having already put the car into neutral gear, the boys worked together to push it in an attempt to roll it into the principal's house. Their aim was to set fire to his car and his house. The principal ran from his house and hid in the nearby woods, from where he could see shadows of the boys running to and fro. With his mobile phone, he frantically dialed the police and anyone else he could think of to come to his rescue. About 2 hours later, at 3 a.m., the police arrived, and while some boys ran away and disappeared into the surrounding sugarcane fields, others were apprehended and held in a classroom under guard by police officers until the dawn's light, when they were interrogated. What had these boys just done? That was the question that everyone was focused on when I showed up at the school the next day. Why had they laid siege to their school that night? The media had already begun reporting the event as rioting and rampaging by students. Many other characterizations and details circulated among the villagers who congregated at the school's gate, and from a handful of teachers and school staff who were keeping to themselves but busily texting on their mobile phones in the school's front courtyard. Police officers, members of the school's board of governors, and a Ministry of Education official were occupying 3 different offices, interviewing the principal, teachers, staff, and others in turn, trying to get to the bottom of what had happened and why. Most of the students were already gone. Those who had been caught or returned on their own in the dawn's early hours had written their anonymous witness reports and then been sent home. With the school so empty and quiet, and the mood among the few remaining people so somber, I found it difficult to imagine how sensational it had been just the night before. The event was over, and all that was left to help in reconstructing what had happened were its remnants. Fragments of the smashed properties, scorched patches of metal on the principal's car, and several dozen written statements and interviewees' responses. Using these as evidence, the investigators, among whom I had become an additional member, tried to piece together a story to explain the students' attacks. Students' accounts of what happened, I'm going to stop reading because this will take too long, but students' accounts of what had happened the day before is that they had felt very troubled and provoked that day before because they had the school's football team had to go and play a match against another team, and they had to get on the school bus and go, and they were ashamed of their school bus. It was really ramshackle, it was really old. It didn't show them off with this sort of bravado they wanted to show up on the field with. But anyway, they took to the field and they played this match, and it was going back and forth. It was really close until one of their star players broke his foot and had to be taken to the hospital. But the principal had sent them without a staff person, just a driver. And so they had to borrow someone from the other school to take this guy to the hospital. Later after the game, which they lost, they were transported back to the school, and they found that the principal was saying, no, they weren't going to get dinner. They didn't get dinner that night, and they were angry. they heard rumors that the principal said they didn't deserve dinner. And so they were very furious about this, and they started muttering amongst themselves and seething with this sort of resentment and frustration towards him. And that was the night that this action took place. So this all, when Kenyans public discourse sort of reflects on cases like this and what was in the media, is often characterized as petty grievances about school rules, principals that are not too kind, diet, school diet, and these kinds of things. But to very little scratching beneath the surface to start revealing more to the story. So for example, why the principal's car? Well, because the principal had actually, they had been collecting money from the parents for 3 years to buy a new school bus, but there was no school bus. In the elections that year, all the candidates for county governor had promised funds towards a new school bus for the school, but there was no school bus. And so where was their money going to? They were asking amongst themselves for a long time, and their parents were asking. And the principal had this car, and he had this scheme where anytime someone needed to go to the medical clinic or the hospital, he would drive them in his own car and charge that student's family money for him taking them in his own car. But actually, the family's already paid a 1,000 shilling emergency fee for such cases. So there was a lot of speculation, a lot of suspicion that the principal was actually embezzling the money that had been raised for the bus, and he was somehow profiting from his own car. So his car as a target was very deliberate. It was a very deliberative communicative act to him, to draw suspicion to him. The sugar and the rice, the students complained that actually, and it was in the witness report, they got deprived of sugar and rice in their diet, whereas the teachers got to enjoy that. So that was unfair. The photocopier was also supposed to have been replaced, but hadn't been. It's also the tool that was going to photocopy their mock exams, which were to take place in the next couple of days. Mock exams happen midway through the school year in Kenya, and they're sort of engaged to see how are students doing so far, how much of the curriculum have they mastered, are they going to be ready for the final exams? And they come sort of months before the final exams. They happen in June or July. Final exams are usually in November, calendar year. And so, academic year. And so the students get nervous about these mock exams for various reasons. One reason being that there's rumors that if there's a lot of cheating on the final exams, those mock exam scores will be used in place of the final exams. Of course, that's never happened. Or they'll be used as checks about whether those students had actually been the ones that wrote that final exam. We have to compare. But there's other reasons as well, and I'm going to get into those a bit later. And so there were reasons around all of it. There were reasons around why the TV. There were reasons around all the targets. And for me, that was really telling, of course, as far as thinking differently about students. This is not rampaging. This is not hooliganism. This is not sort of hot blood in the moment. All kinds of rationale. How much of that rationalization happened afterwards? How much happened before? I couldn't answer those questions yet. So then that was 2013, I returned in 2014, I returned in 2016, I returned in 2018, and I did different parts of the study, just kind of kept growing. At the time when I started, I thought it was a paper. I didn't realize it was going to be a book, and then I was like, I just have to keep going. And my methods included showing up at sites where there'd been a fire a couple of days before, a week before, a year before, doing going from school to school around the province, around the country actually, many different regions, do focus group discussions with students, with teachers, about what had happened at school, what they believed other students were trying to achieve, lots of conversations interpreting what this was all about. In 2016, I returned and spent several months with a small research team in a boys' school and a girls' school, spending time in those schools that had had fires, one that year and one the year before, just what was the experience of students in these schools. And in 2018, several interviews with students that were 10 years out from their experience of having been in secondary school and participated somehow in collective arson attacks on the schools. And so, and that was sort of a time for me to understand what these meant with that sort of narrative reflection 10 years out. And so, quickly, what I have here, I mean, of course, part of my question was, how are these all strikes? How do students conceptualize strikes? And how, in particular, I was fascinated by these of collective arson. How do you go from these scenes of students marching out of their school to make their dissent known, to make their frustrations or grievances known, to setting fire to parts of the school? What's that logic? What's happening there? And so that was sort of one of the motivating questions, really, for this research. And I did not start my timer, so apologies. So I'll start it with 10 minutes less. I think that's probably appropriate. Right, so I also started just collecting everything I could about these school fires, media reports, government reports. And the government has done reports. They have done reports in, for example, 2008 and 2016. They have had these parliamentary task forces where they traveled all over the country, interviewed thousands of teachers and parents and students, showing up at schools, and collecting data and coming up with these huge reports about what are the causes, the contributing factors to arson. So there's definitely a public recognition and a concern about these fires. But the government hadn't been collecting systematic data. They did in 2018, they did in 2016, they did a little bit in 2017, but all these years in between they didn't. And so my counting is from media reports as well as any other sources I could find, and there are several different kinds of sources that I detail in the book. And I came up with a very conservative, I think, underestimate of attempted arson cases in secondary schools of 750 between 2008 and 2018. There have been school fires before 2008, and I get into that history, I account for that history, and there have certainly been since. There was one last week. They're happening. They're happening, I would say, on a weekly basis, and they happen in all regions of the country, in boys' schools, all boys' schools, all girls' schools, all mixed schools. They happen at good schools that are getting really great final exam scores among their students, and schools that don't. And they're happening at government and private schools. And I count all that. But so these can't be reduced to a ethnic or class or regional kind of phenomenon, which is a bit unusual for Kenya, because a lot does actually get explained in terms of regional and ethnic divisions and class divisions. And so, but the consistent point in all of the data was they're happening in boarding schools, not day schools. And so there's something I have to know about boarding schools and that experience. And so I've done a lot of thinking about boarding schools as well as the study in boarding schools. The data also, everything I could find through my own data collection, talking to people about what was happening in schools, but also in all the media reports and stuff, is I spent a lot of time paying attention to patterns and exceptions to the patterns. And so, of course, the first pattern being boarding schools, another patterns in where and when these fires were taking place. So a pattern is where they take place, boarding schools, also dormitories. Dorms are the #1 target. That is the pattern. There are exceptions, like in the case I just read about Kenyan school, where the exceptions were a photocopier in the principal's car, sometimes it's a bus, it can be all these other targets. So the exceptions, I'm really interested in the patterns because that indicates something. So why dorms? That was a big question that I entertained and got to a lot of answers for why dorms and why these other targets. And then when are they happening? As I said, a lot of them are happening around mock exam time. I have anxiety with those exam scores. But what's interesting about that, when I probed further in talking to students and at the school, realizing what was happening there, it wasn't only about what the score would be and how that might be used as a final score justification, but actually it was the fact that this is coming at the very end of the longest term. There's 3 terms, second term in a boarding school. All students want to just be released. They want to go home for a week or 2, as they talk about. They want a break from, as they call, some of them call them prisons. And of course, this is not every student. Some students like the boarding school experiences, but I'm talking about the logic here behind what's happening. What happens in a lot of schools is if the score, a principal or a teacher will set as a goal score for a student and for the whole class as a median. And if students don't meet that score, they are first humiliated at assembly, publicly. Their names are read out. They might be punished in front of others, like a physical punishment in front of others at that assembly. They're mocked. It's embarrassing. There's a lot of humiliation, shame. And I take that really seriously because life in boarding school is really geared. It's a totalizing experience to those exams, or it's meant to be. Of course, there's social life as well. And so students are really driven into this idea that they are at boarding school to get that exam score. And that's why boarding schools are really also very appreciated among their parents. Make all kinds of sacrifices for them to be there. It's a privilege to be at a boarding school where you can You don't have to do domestic chores, you're not being distracted by others, you're really focused to those exam scores. So the ideas of success and failure are just hinged on these exam scores. So to fail and to be embarrassed and humiliated like that can be very demoralizing in that moment. That doesn't happen. Those public assemblies and that demoralization doesn't happen after final exam scores because you're back home already when the scores come out a month later. So there isn't that same experience. And then if you actually have not achieved the score your teacher wanted you to achieve, you can be told you're not going home for break. You have to stay here and do extra revision. And so students hate that. and they will invite dormitories. First of all, dormitories are less surveilled than classrooms. Students have more private access to them. They have flammable materials in them, mattresses, sometimes curtains. But they are also the containers that keep them at the school. And so students will say, you don't just burn one dorm, you burn two or more. Because if you just burn one, you'll all get housed in together, and these dorms are already congested. And so there's going to be extra congested. And so you have to burn more than two, so they send us home for a break. So it's really trying to get this break from this experience in these schools. So obviously that points me to boarding schools. But there are boarding schools around the world, right? There are boarding schools in many different countries, as you know. And I've done some studies of those, tried to find the literature on those. And there are cases of arson, as you would expect, in schools, in day schools and boarding schools. But not with the same regularity, with not the same features of collective action and regular appearance, and how high profile these are also in the public discourse as a trend pattern. But there's also arson in school, as you know. So I also don't want this case that and this is not happening in this room, of course, with you, but I see it in sort of lazy media reporting and some policy rhetoric, you know, at a very irresponsible level of, you know, this idea that Kenyan students are somehow hooligans or somehow unthinking or somehow rash. Kenyans someplace also will list in public conversation, public discourse about the sort of hot-blooded youth and all of this. And I don't want Kenyans to stand out as some kind of exception here. And students set fires. England is one of the countries with so many fires in schools, as you probably know. Different kinds of fires, as I understand from the literature, like in trash bins and bathrooms, and sometimes, you know, it seems much more of an individual matter. And so when you do this research, it's quite interesting where patterns come up. Sweden, for example, a place where a lot of fires in schools in Sweden. I didn't know that before this research. And so these, for me, I had to really think about the comparisons here and what was standing out and what wasn't, and what stood out from these cases. And of course, that is that they're collective actions, and there's a whole logic about them. And it's a logic, interestingly, that I found that is understood in Kenya. Has a lot of significance in Kenya. Has a lot of history. Has a lot of engagement. And so I spent quite a bit of time in the book looking at that, and I'm going to turn to that in a little bit. I'm going to move to a part of the research here about returning to that question of why boarding schools. What is going on in boarding schools? What is that experience? So as I said, we spent several months at 2 schools. In the book, there's a chapter devoted to this sort of experience near account, sort of an ethnographic account of girls at this school that I call Central Kenya Girls School. And this was done in 2016 in the final term. And there had been a lot of fires in 2016. 2016 was the year that had the biggest spike in fires, mainly in June and July, but around the school calendar. And you know, more than this, I think it was 276 fires that year, counted for as arson. These are not electrical wires. Like sometimes it gets blamed on electrical faulty wiring, and I excluded those cases. And so the government reported 236 cases in 2016. And so the education cabinet secretary that year was saying he was waging war, this is the language he used, against the fire setters. And he was blaming tribal animosities, communities. He was blaming cartels, exam cheating cartels. He was blaming he had a lot of targets, and I go into those targets and how reliable maybe his discourse was there. But one of the actions he wanted to take is a lockdown, a crackdown and a lockdown on students in schools. And there have been many cases of this in different ways, trying to ban cell phones, trying to ban not selling petrol to young people, all kinds of different actions, increasing surveillance in schools, still a top priority reaction to this. But in 2016, in the fall, he said the final term, no one's leaving the school at all for 3 months. No one, not a teacher, not a principal, no one's allowed to leave. You guys are in lockdown to get to those final exams, to stamp out cheating. And he was also very much making a name for himself as the anti-corruption minister in that government, which worked for him very much. He landed very well, went on to Interior. He built a reputation for himself through fighting the education system, straightening the education system, taking a heavy hand to the education system, and he got promoted to Interior Minister, so for security in the country, and he now is actually kind of a bigwig in the UN. And so, because he was sort of ousted in August with the last government. But he's sort of very revered in Kenya for how he really took firm control of the education system. So a lot of blaming of young people here in that discourse. Anyway, so in chapter 6, I'm talking about that term we spent with those young people in these 2 schools. I was in the middle school. And this was everyone. I mean, as I said, the boarding schools. Why? And there's a social prestige about boarding schools. There's a history there. It's a colonial history of an imported model from Britain. When it was racially segregated under colonialism, the white students got to go to, the white children got to go to boarding schools. They were seen of very good quality, the structures, the buildings themselves, the activities that were there, and then the next level of when, some in the colonial period, and then in the post-colonial period, the boarding schools were opened up, and Kenya's elite, that became the elite, through politics and business and opinion leaders in churches and the media, they went to those boarding schools. And other boarding schools that were being built to emulate those. And this was very much the imported model. The headmasters and headmistresses and prefects and dining hall prefects and the hierarchical authority that was very unaccountable. A lowly student doesn't talk back, doesn't have a place in that. Students today experience it like that. The prefects are called the cops. The other students are called the civilians. There's mass punishments meted out with no accountability. You can't stand up and speak back to that. And so there's a history there that is, there's a history that esteems the role of secondary schools because they are boarding schools. They are seen as the best quality, and they still are. There's a very unequal education system in Kenya. Tiered, you get streamed out of your primary school exams into what school you'll be eligible for, and then of course you can only go to the national or the county or extra county schools. If you have the money. Usually the boarding schools, there's more day schools being built now, trying to reach education for all at secondary level. If you also have the money to pay for the boarding schools, which is also obviously a cost differential here to some degree. And if you're at a day school for secondary school, you're probably not going on. And the exam scores show this, that it's been streamed out, but also the teaching is better. The teachers show up more. There's better facilities. So those students at those boarding schools do perform better, and they're the ones that go on. The small percentage that go on to university, to tertiary education in Kenya are tend to be from those schools. So you want to get to a boarding school if you can. And the other reason is because, as I explained, when you're at a boarding school, your schedule, your whole being there is devoted to that exam score at the end of it. As those of you that are familiar with the Kenya education system are probably wondering, but this is all changing now, right? And so we can have that conversation. I'll try to get to the very end, and we can have that in the discussion. So you want to be at an exam school, or you want to be at a boarding school. Students just feel lucky to be there when they arrive. Generally, they're devoted to it. There's an understanding that this will be an arduous experience. It will be difficult for you. And there's sayings that go along with this. There's a lot of signposting and mottos and sort of inspirational sayings across boarding schools, across boarding schools. And one that I saw in a number of schools reads, the fruits of education are sweet, but their roots are bitter. So it is expected that this will be a painful and difficult experience. You will suffer during this experience, but it will pay off. And you can see these signs, some of them are actually the tree, and you see all these difficult roots, like all the hunger and homesickness and all of these difficult things you're going to go through, and then prosperity and career and all these wonderful things, the fruits of this education that you'll finally get to get through this. And so that's kind of accepted. That's going to be the way. And of course, this is different for what the case, and I get into this in this chapter, where you're coming from. Sometimes a boarding school experience is a privileged experience for you because you have your own bed for the first time. You're not sharing a mattress with others. You don't have to do certain kinds of labor. Maybe you do get to devote more time to your studies that it was hard for you to do before if you were at home. So there's different experiences, of course, of feeling privileged and feeling that this is a hardship. So these are some photos from the schools we were at. The latrines, a perennial complaint among students for how filthy and dirty they are and not enough. A place that most students hate. A lot of talk about, a lot of our conversations were about this experience, a very embodied experience. So I really analyze in terms of the embodied experience of being in these schools, how, as girls would say, you always feel dirty. You always feel cold. You're made to feel cold. You're supposed to be up at, they say 5 officially, 5 in the morning for studies, but actually students get up at 3:30 or 4. One of my methods is some students were keeping diaries for us. It's short diaries. Waking up at 3:30 to start my preps. They go and they sit in the classroom to do revision for the first 2 hours of the day before breakfast when classes start. And they're told, no, you will sit there, you're allowed to wear 1 sweater. You can't layer 2 sweaters, that's not allowed. So these rules that the students are complaining, grumbling about with each other. Why does it have to be so cold? Why do we have to feel this cold? Why is the matron not taking that sick girl to the clinic to be checked? Why is she leaving her in the sick room? That is something to worry about. She might be really sick. She might die. Students have died, and other students know it. They have died at boarding schools because of neglect. And so the students are talking amongst themselves all the time, grumbling, talking and showing signs. They are being very vigilant about what's going on at the school. What's fair and what's not? What's tolerable and what's not? Why are we made to feel this way? Is that fair? And those conversations happen all the time. Is this fair? Is this just? Why are they treating us like this? And a lot is accepted. A lot of corporal punishment is accepted. At the school we were at, very regular corporal punishment. No one blinks an eye. You know when you're going to have an infraction. You know when you're going to have 6 of the best without interruption, which is 6 raps with a Bunsen burner pipe on your hand for speaking English on a Swahili day, or for running between classes, anything. There's all kinds of infractions that that's what your punishment is going to be. There are teachers that have nicknames like Bazé, because when he hits you on the back, you buzz through your body. Bazé. The students call him that. So this is part of it. People kind of laugh about it. Students would say, yeah, there's caning here, caning being hit with a stick, there's caning here, but it's a good school, it's a very disciplined school. This is working. But then some acts are intolerable. These students tell the story of how their last principal, the year before, when the fire happened, had slapped a girl on the face at assembly right in front of everyone else. And it's not acceptable. To slap someone in the face is so demeaning. Those were their ways of describing that. And so there's all this work going on, all this vigilance going on among students, this socializing of really sort of what are the norms that we agree to be governed by and what are not. And so that work is ongoing all the time. So a dormitory, as I said, very congested, the assembly hall, which is where church services are held, a classroom, this is the boys' school where we were, the dining hall, the latrines. So kind of just to give you a picture of what kinds of schools we're talking about here. And so then I moved to, after that experience, and thinking about how we could get to the point of being convinced somehow to move away from, it's a spectacular contradiction in my eyes. So many people believe in education still. Families and children are putting so much effort and money and time into this and hope into this. And then there's these fires, this destruction, this sabotage of everything you were holding dear. I don't understand it. And so, what is behind this this move to that? And the boarding school analysis that study helped me fill that in of how can you move from this individual, very purposeful individualization of students to, I'm only concerned with my exam score, I'm here for this, I'm totally dedicated to this collective action and this willingness to risk it all together with a totally different logic about what is acceptable treatment and what is not. and how that figures into, and then I had to do the work myself to think about how that figures into education as well. So why arson? So here we have sort of a note, a warning, from some boys at a different school that I collected, and this is them basically saying, we don't want to do the exam. This is mock exam coming up. And if you don't cancel that, you're going to be sorry. This is a warning. Sometimes these are on chalkboards. Sometimes there's suggestion boxes. And it was ignored. And a few days later, they torched their dorms. I analyzed this question, why arson, in terms of the idea of a situated repertoire. This is from Charles Tilley in social movement theory. It's learned, it's historically specific, it's rooted in existing social structures. And so I do a lot of work thinking about arson, the roles arson has played in Kenya's history, how young people have learned this. And also considering how young people explain it themselves. And I met with the boys at the school, explaining and saying, like, it works, actually. First, it's very rational, it's very efficacious, because we don't get caught. Like, if you go for that march and you're showing your face, they know who you are, and you get singled out as troublemakers, and you're sent home, or you're suspended or expelled, your parents get mad at you, or you're just labeled as a troublemaker and life is going to be much more difficult for you. And so it's easy. So when you do arson, it happens to you in a night, it's very hard to pin it down on individuals. It's very hard to have evidence. Even if you're sort of told on and everyone names you, the court case, students know this, the police would probably not find the evidence. The court case will probably not go through, because where's the evidence to actually say it was me, other than the people saying it was me? And the students also say, and the police, when they take you in for interrogation, there's a lot of abuse, and you can just say you were coerced into your testimony and into your admission of guilt. So they kind of don't trust that process either, which is pretty savvy. So you probably won't get caught. And it's efficacious because what it does is it draws attention. The Board of Governors, all these people that showed up at that fire the next morning and start paying attention to what's going on in this school. Why doesn't this principal have their obedience? What are they all angry about when they start collecting those stories? Like the police in Dadaab did, collecting stories of what are these young people angry about, and then calling to account. So that is a way of enforcing some kind of accountability over the school and what's happening in young people's lives there. And so here it is, being able to actually practice some kind of accountability over who's governing their lives. And so principals get transferred. Principals get, so that principal moves on. Maybe students have some kind of small reforms in their lives. Better diet is improved, maybe more consultations. They bring in student forums, things like this. So there's sort of some. And then as young people would say, it's the only option at the end of the day. We've tried suggestion, and they will very rationally describe this. We start with a suggestion box. If they ignore that, then we try this. If they ignore that, then it's fire. Because that's the only thing we're left with. And it works because we get the attention we want at the end. So why does it work? I spend chapter 3 looking at public discourse about the student fires. And I do that because I think the ideas that are circulating in Kenya about these fires and what's behind them and what's, why students do this and who's to blame is all influential context. It makes the fires meaningful, and they're registered in the public discourse as sort of meaningful actions. Now, no adult in Kenya condones arson. Like, it is really widely condemned, of course. It's terrifying. I should say, I'm sorry, I haven't mentioned already, even though these are happening in dorms, the vast majority are not deadly. There's not targeting of people. There have been some very tragic cases. So for example, in over 300 fires between 2015 and 2018, one was deadly. And that fire was actually an exception. There was one lone student. She set fire to a dorm with students asleep in it already. And so that was actually an exception to this pattern. And it gets played, the BBC just ran a story, it gets played as the actual story of what's happening in Kenyan schools, and it is not, that's the exception. The trend, pattern is it's collective action that builds over time, and collective action is taken in a sort of, in a way that is intended, an intentional way. So this public discourse I'm really interested in. So this is a picture here of these elders in Meru conducting what they call a ritual, what's presented as a ritual curse on arsonists. They didn't know who the arsonists were. They were pointing pointing blame in all directions. It could be these cartels, these shadowy people in the background, it could be students. There's a lot of talk among these elders. It was reported, talking to young people today doesn't work. We need to bring the cane back. It needs to be disciplined. Talking won't work with these people, with these young people. What's interesting about this, and I use this as one example, and I use all the government reports as another example, and I use, there's a very popular, one of the most popular TV shows for years in Kenya is called Tahiti High, and it's a drama, a weekly drama, a serial about young people in a boarding school. They go through all these moral dilemmas, and there's like several episodes about students wanting to set fire to their school. And so I look at one of those in the book as well, and the sort of way it's being talked about. And these ideas are really interesting because they definitely reflect more than just a concern, as you would expect, with just the fires in the schools. Everyone reads this as broader concerns about Kenyan political society. Where are we going as a nation? Our moral fiber? What's happening with parenting? What's happening with these young people today? How do they learn this violence? It's in our politics. Of course they're seeing it and they're practicing it. And so there's a really interesting ambivalence about blaming young people. Young people are to blame, they're blamed, but they're also seen as not actually completely culpable because they've learned these behaviors, because it makes sense. And so I think this is really obviously important to pay attention to as well, the way this is talked about, because this fuels the fires. Students know, they're savvy to this, they know this works. They know that there's a conversation that is a little bit willing to extend them that role of maybe they were right. Like, we don't agree with this arson, but there was something going on in that school. There's something they're unhappy about, and what else could they do? So this is that acceptance. This is a cartoon that was published in an online journalism by Gatto, who is like one of there's so many active political cartoonists in Kenya who are brilliant, and he is very well known. So this is one in 2018. It's called School Fires 2018 ... So continuing, and I do some work with these cartoons as well, because this is we see who's in the frame. It's the Ministry of Education versus the Teachers Union having a fight here, and the media is really focused on that. The media is not even looking at the fire. There's no students in this picture. They're not the perpetrators. They're not part of this story. The fires are actually a backdrop for a political stories that everyone wants to pay attention to. Here's parents, head in the sand, don't want to see it, don't want to deal with it. This is how they're being blamed, hoping for some kind of intervention here. Here's a politician, fueling the fire with his brand of politics. And then here's all these possible reasons, and these come out in the government reports too: poor teaching, societal pressures, fees, inadequate teachers, poor management of the school, all these reasons. But all those reasons are just going to be burnt to a crisp, and they're not going to be standing anymore. And so there is this, this is a really, I don't know, I think this captures a lot of this sort of way that the fires are really a backdrop, really reflecting like just for all these other concerns and conversations and controversies happening in Kenya. And also showing us that they're not actually being taken seriously as the problem themselves. And those government reports do the same thing. Those government reports have 149 contributing factors, 49 recommendations of things to do. Some of those are parents need to spend more time with their children. Some are children shouldn't have pocket money to buy soda to mix with alcohol. I mean, they run the gamut of every aspect of life, and they're not implemented. They're very comprehensive, but they don't do that analytical work to actually think about transformations.
Yes.
Yeah, 1 minute. Yeah, I'm on that. So in 2016, that year when there were so many fires, the sitting president at the time, Uhuru Kenyatta, responded to this, and he said, "Dawa ya moto ni moto," in Swahili. The medicine for fire is fire. We will fight fire with fire. We will come back at those young people with more violence. So you see this in this is Patrick Athar's cartoon. How many times do I have to remind you the answer that violence is not the answer? But this is how I'm teaching you that. So my last slide. I pull out, of course, of all this analysis, this very detailed analysis, to try and make some bigger arguments that we can take, certainly to reflect on Kenya. That's a big argument here. This is a reflection on Kenya. The young people in these schools are learning, they read their microcosm, they read their secondary school, their boarding school experiences, the microcosms of the way political society works in Kenya, the way authority, the way chances are unequal, the way authority is meted out, the way you don't have voice.
So they make those parallels very easily. They think they are apprenticing into what will be, they're successfully apprenticing into the way their lives are going to be governed and how their opportunities for responding to that. I think that's important, paying attention to schools. I don't think it's always done. I'm not, maybe this is the wrong audience for that, I'm not an education studies scholar, I'm an anthropologist, and I speak to a lot of political anthropologists, anthropology of politics, and there we pay a lot of attention to youth as agitators, as protesters when they're in the street and when they're online, but we're not necessarily paying attention to them in schools. And I think schools are exemplary sites of where young people are experimenting and practicing and making sense, building up their logics and their norms of their political subjectivities. So I think schools need to be paid attention to, obviously. And then I try to frame this for what lessons can we draw outside of the Kenyan case to speak beyond the Kenyan case. And I think some of those lessons are, you have seen in your reading and your own studies, case after case of young people being told education is going to be the ticket for success, for the life, that's the promise, that's the globalized promise for education for all. And young people, many don't do it, but it's a very, as I argue, I find a very submissive, docile sense of failure in a lot of places, a lot of demoralization. We see in different kinds of ways this is practiced out in different cases, and anthropologists and others have captured this. And what I think we see in Kenya is something very different. It is a defiance to go quietly. It's a defiance to take that failure. I mean, there's a sense of failure, there's a sense of really deep insecurity and distrust that this education will actually work out, that it's not actually being delivered the way it should, and it probably won't work out. And so I think these actions, and so finally I analyze this as young people, this burning, young people are not actually trying to destroy their education at all. They're trying to improve it. They're trying to actually improve their chances of success. They're not actually somehow resorting to their own failure. Thank you.